Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So today we are at gate 102 of the 108 gates of dharma-illumination. So we're coming to the end. Okay, so today's gate statement says, entry into all conduct is a gate of dharma-illumination, for with it we attain realization of the Buddha I. So this might sound very similar to last week's statement, right, which was entry into the state of unrestricted speech is a gate of dharma illumination, for with it we attain realization of the dharma I. So clearly there's some connection going on, right? Most of the kanji in those two statements are the same, and the structure is the same, so probably they're related, showing us two sides of something, right? So the kanji in this statement that's being translated conduct is gyo, and gyo is a really important word for us in this tradition. There are various ways to translate it. One is conduct. It can also mean practice or action or activity. So clearly there's a lot to chew on when we think about gyo and how gyo works. So as usual, let's start taking apart this statement. So we'll start with conduct, because that seems fairly specific. If you're looking at all the definitions of this word, practice, activity, action, conduct. Conduct seems pretty specific, right? Conduct usually means behavior. It usually means deportment. We think about good conduct as being having good manners, right? Following the rules, behaving in some ethical way. So actually, this English word conduct is kind of interesting because we can read it conduct as a verb as well as conduct as a noun, right? So the original Latin word means bringing together, brought together, which seems like a strange place to start. As it makes its way into English, it starts to mean safe passage, you know? So to conduct someone safely from one place to another, to ensure safe passage. And when you read that, you go, well, golly, bodhisattvas, right? Helping people across to the other shore. And you just think there's a weird sort of connection there, which I thought was really interesting. So now conduct has a sense of guiding, leading, managing, right? Ultimately, we have conduct, how we manage ourselves, how we manage our behavior. So conduct in the context of day-to-day practice can be concerned with forms, also can be concerned with precepts, shila, ethics, right? So these are how we actualize our understanding in concrete ways with this karmic human body. So considering our conduct is a great practice, of course, for letting go of self-clinging, right? Getting along in a sangha requires that we consider the needs of others and the situation of others. We can't sort of run around doing whatever with this body, speech, and mind. We understand interconnectedness, and so that just stops making sense to us. It stops working. I can't do whatever I want without regard for other beings because I deeply understand interconnectedness. So in that circumstance, then, of course, wisdom and compassion arise naturally. When we see with wisdom and we understand what compassion is based on interconnectedness, those things arise naturally. This is not something we have to go get, not something we have to put on. That's what's there. So practice forms reflect wisdom and compassion the way manners reflect etiquette. Those two are not the same thing, manners and etiquette, right? So etiquette has to do with the underlying principles for how we get along in a society, which we need, right? Things like consideration, respect, honesty, graciousness, basic kindness, right? The sort of foundations of how we get along with people in a society or in a community. Those things don't change over time, I hope, right? Doesn't matter who you're looking at, doesn't matter who you're living with, who you're dealing with. These kind of basic respect, honesty, you know, those things don't change over time. Manners can be situational, right? So what we do at a state dinner at Buckingham Palace is not what we do when we're eating at home with our friends. Those manners are situational. So, you know, what was appropriate 100 years ago or 500 years ago is not necessarily appropriate here and now. So, but the basic principles that underlie those things, that underlie those changing manners, don't change. We still need to have respect and honesty and graciousness and basic kindness, right? The way those manifest may change. So Dogen tells us if we want to practice the way, we should practice the conduct of the ancestors. So, doing exactly what our ancestors were doing in that culture and time might not feel appropriate today. Things change, right? Expectations change. And we can get a bit stuck when we read old texts and we just think, that doesn't feel okay, right? There were some expectations of the people, of their times and cultures. So, practicing the conduct of the ancestors, we have to be a little bit thoughtful about what that means, because I think it's pointing to the attitude, to the understanding, which is the same. In our Zazen in particular, we enter into that same space with all the Buddhas and ancestors and everybody who's sitting, right? So our actions or our conduct are rooted in a larger understanding, and I think that's an important thing to remember. It's not an act we're putting on. It's not a performance we're learning to do. These are actions that arise, conduct that arises based on our wisdom and compassion, based on our deep understanding. So it makes sense that precepts and ethics are a part of this thing, right? This is the Shila section, for instance, of the Eightfold Path, right? Speech and action and livelihood. So last week we talked about unrestricted speech, for instance, so we can start to see how these two gate statements are not separate. So Gyo as action covers everything we do with this body, speech, and mind. Of course, the three places we create karma, or the three things we use to create karma. So whether we're in the temple or not, whether somebody's watching us or not, this is how we move through the world as bodhisattvas. What are we doing in the zendo, and what are we doing when we're out of the zendo? What are we doing on the cushion, and then how do we take that practice into the world? So Dogen Zenji says, without having the slightest expectation, maintain the prescribed manner of conduct. So Todo-san has talked about this section previously in other years. And he points out, for people living in the training temple, the prescribed manner of conduct is follow the schedule, do what the community is doing, take your service position, do that thoroughly, do your work assignment thoroughly, wholeheartedly taking on all the activities of the day in the temple. That is the prescribed manner of conduct. That's what they expect of us when we show up there. We don't get to say, no, I don't want to do that job today, or, I feel like sleeping in. We're doing the prescribed conduct, which is the practice of the community, and folding ourselves in. But for lay people, or for those of us who don't live in a temple, right? It means taking care of our jobs, taking care of our families, our responsibilities in the world, living in the community, right? All the things that we just do to carry out our life. So doing those things in a sustainable way, in an ethical way, in a wise and compassionate way, where we are taking into account our effect on people and beings, right? And what we're putting into the network. So when I think about life in the training temple, as I'm thinking about this, life in the training temple, the person who supervises novices' conduct is the Ino. So in the West, the Ino doesn't quite have the same function because most of our Dharma centers are lay centers. We're not training novices. So the Ino is not running around necessarily supervising novices' conduct. You'll often see that person doing a lot of the kind of things Doju is doing today, leading chanting, helping to manage the zendo, making sure people have what they need, right? It's slightly different here. It's still an officer position. It's still an important officer position. But, outside the temple, we have to supervise our conduct as bodhisattvas for ourselves. So when we come here, Doju's not necessarily supervising our conduct. If we're doing something wrong or non-standard, he may come and help us with that, but that's kind of not his thing, right? And outside the temple, we have to supervise our conduct for ourselves. We don't have an Ino on our shoulder, right? Or a teacher on our shoulder, or something running around, supervising our conduct. So we get to take on that practice of considering our conduct for ourselves. So in that section, Dogen Zenji goes on, think of acting to save and benefit living beings. Earnestly carry out all good deeds and give up former evil ones solely for the sake of becoming the foundation of happiness for human and heavenly beings. Without stagnating in good deeds of the present, continue practicing your whole lifetime. This is coming from the Shobogenzo's Rimonki, right? So Gyo can also be translated as performance, and we have to be really careful about that. We can really get stuck and kind of go down the rabbit hole if we translate this thing as performance and cling to that. What performance means in this context is carrying something out. We're performing a duty, like we're carrying out something. Not perform as in putting on a show, putting on an act, becoming inauthentic in some way. So there is certainly a tradition of very carefully constructing and performing, if you will, rituals in Japanese Buddhism, particularly in the more esoteric schools. Where you do that is very important, how it's done, who's there, time of day, what imagery is present, right? All of that is part of that activity, part of that performing of a ritual. It adds meaning, it makes it more or less effective in some ways, right? So all of those things are designed to affect participants' experience of what they see and what they hear and kind of how they take that in. So the ceremonies may be very elaborate, but the point of that is not entertainment. The point of that is not to impress people, right? The point of that is to enter into a practice space in a particular way. So there is performing as in carrying out, but no part of that is not wholehearted. No part of that is separate or inauthentic. So in fact, of course, we know this whole thing is one of the 5 points of practice at Sanshin, keeping forms and ceremonies simple in order to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, so we don't slip into a performance kind of mode. So, you know, the point for us is to maintain the connection with Zazen, and with Zazen mind. So rather than just being performances, these forms should come from the mind of Shikantaza. They should be arising as an expression of our understanding. So our practice here, of course, includes a relatively small number of the forms and formalities that you might see in other Soto-Zen places. If you go to Zen-Shuji in Los Angeles, you will see things that you don't see here. If you go to a training temple in Japan, you will see things you don't see here. We don't engage in that level of formality, not because we don't think forms are important. There's a kind of a misperception sometimes in this Western Soto-Zen conversation. Oh yeah, Sanshin, they don't do forms because they don't like them. Or they don't know how to do them, or they don't think they're important. That's not at all what's happening here. When we need to be elaborate, we are. When I go to Zen-Shuji, I do whatever they ask of me, right? The point is not picking and choosing and liking and disliking. We do a few forms here. We do them simply so that we can understand what we're doing. Why are we doing this thing? In what way is this arising from our understanding and the way we see the world? You know, how do we keep the connection between the forms and the mind of Shikantaza so that the outward forms come from the inside? So when somebody's being a jisha, what is that? It's not a performance, right? So recently I had an email from Doryu, my Dharma brother in Rome, and he was asking about our world peace ceremony, because he knows we do a world peace ceremony every 30 days. And he's feeling like he wants to introduce that in his Sangha because the world is on fire. And it's on fire here, but it's on fire in a different way in Europe. The world is on fire. He wants to sort of introduce that as a practice for his Sangha. So, you know, he said, what do you do? And I told him, you know, we do the Heart Sutra and we do this echo. And I sent him our echo, which he liked very much. And he said, you know, I remember being in Japan. So we based this ceremony on something that actually happens every 30 days in the training temple. And he said, you know, I remember when I was in Japan, we offered sweet water and we offered tea before this ceremony. And I said, you could certainly do that. And being Sanshin, we keep it very simple. So if that feels meaningful to make those kinds of offerings, and that's coming from a place of Shikantaza, do it, absolutely. So, whatever forms we choose to do here, we just try to do them thoroughly, without separation into an I that's performing some kind of ritual. There is just something happening there. Total dynamic functioning is happening there. So we let go of extras like, I'm using this conduct to build my ego. Am I not a wonderful practitioner because I'm doing this thing? Or am I not better than somebody else? You know, there's two ways you can look at that. Isn't Sanshin better than everyone else because we do this very stripped down, kind of very intensive, clean practice? And, somebody else can say, are we not better because we do all of these elaborate things and we know how? So it's just so easy to get your ego stuck in there, right? Sometimes people come here because they don't like form. And they think, great, this is a place I can practice without form. Okay, but we need to understand why. So we just fold ourselves kind of seamlessly into whatever is happening in the community. And when we do, then those forms are alive as a complete manifestation, right, of a complete functioning of practice realization. There's no gap. That's what we're headed for with these forms and conduct. So gyo also shows up in rigyo, helpful conduct, or guess what, beneficial action. We've just spent a lot of time here talking about Shishobo, beneficial action being one of those 4 practices of the Bodhisattva. So in the largest sense, this means doing good for others with body, speech, and mind. And in that way, connecting beings with the Dharma. So as Bodhisattvas, this is how we liberate beings. This kind of conduct is how we actually carry out Bodhisattva vows. So the statement again, entry into all conduct is a gate of dharma-illumination, for with it we attain realization of the Buddha I. So we've seen gyo as conduct. It can also mean practice. So whatever we're doing as a realization of awakening or a manifestation of our Buddha nature, we can say all of that is conduct or gyo. There's an important nuance here because it's not whatever we're doing to realize awakening. It's whatever we're doing as a realization of awakening, right? There's no grasping. I'm doing this in order to get something, do something, be something, right? This is what we do as a realization, as a manifestation of our awakening. So, as Dogen Zenji says, practice and realization arise together. So he wrote 3 fascicles of the Shobogenzo, which are related in some way to gyo. Well, there's probably more than 3, but at least 3 important ones related to gyo. So there's gyoji, which is continuous practice. There's gyobutsu igi, which is dignified conduct of practice Buddhas, which is a whole interesting thing. And there's daishu gyo, which is great practice. So there's gyo in each of these 3, right? So practicing is a manifestation of the Dharma as opposed to practicing to transform into something or someone else. That's daishu gyo, great practice. So clearly this gyo was an important element for him. There was something about this that he wanted us to get. He's given us 3 opportunities here to investigate what practice is, what conduct is, what gyo is about. So gyoji, this first one, continuous practice, is often represented as a circle. So you may wonder why you constantly, in the world of at least Western Zen, many Dharma centers use this circle as a logo, right, a symbol, or it shows up in the teaching and the practice. So there's 2 ways we can think about what continuous practice is. One is this need to practice moment by moment by moment based on vow and repentance, right? So we vow to save beings. At the end of this talk, we're going to vow to save them again. We also know we're never going to get to the end of that practice, the end of that vow. And in the next minute, we have repentance because we recognize we're taking this vow, but we're never going to get to the end of that. So we're not paralyzed by that, but there's this constant vow, repentance, vow, repentance, vow, repentance, right? So in that way, practice is continuous. So again and again and again we do this. We don't just do it once. So it's not a matter of taking lay precepts, vowing to save beings, and then you're done. Or coming to a Dharma talk, chanting the Bodhisattva vows, and then you're done, right? We do this over and over and over again. So again and again, we're engaging in zazen work and study, zazen work and study. We don't just do it one time. And even after we have maybe some little awakening experience, or we have some bit of insight into how the world works, then we get to practice with integrating that into our bodhisattva activity. Now, how do I see the world differently? Now, what do I do with that, right? So we're never quite done. So the other way we can understand gyoji and this circle is to say that, again, practice and realization arise together. So, Dogen's fascicle about gyoji, he says, in the great way of the Buddhas and ancestors, there is always unsurpassable continuous practice in which the way is like a circle without interruption. Between the arousing of awakening mind, practice, awakening, and nirvana, there is not the slightest break. Continuous practice is the circle of the way. So in all our activities on and off the cushion, in and out of the zendo, practice and realization are already there. So this is end, there's no end to this circle, right? Okay, so then there's Daishigyo, great practice. Practice that transcends all distinctions, all separations. There's good and bad and going beyond good and bad. This is familiar to us, right? There's being affected by cause and effect, not being affected by cause and effect, going beyond being affected or not, if you know the wild fox koan, right? So this pattern, we see it all the time. There's thinking, there's not thinking, there's non-thinking or beyond thinking. So going beyond distinction in our practice means not negating one side or the other side, not falling into one side or the other side. In other words, there are two things, it appears that there are two things, but they don't cancel each other out. So that can be a challenge for us. It can feel like cognitive dissonance. How can I hold thinking and not thinking? What's in the middle of that, right? What is this non-thinking? What is this hishigyo about, right? So we see form and emptiness as form and emptiness, and we also see two sides of one reality, right? So we need the largest possible picture. So, that's a quick thing about Daishigyo. Finally, there's Gyobutsu Igi, the dignified conduct of practice Buddhas. Now, you could spend a year digging into Gyobutsu Igi. So, I just want to say here, so dignified conduct of practice Buddhas. Dignified does not mean snooty and stuffy and kind of, right? We have this picture about what dignified is. The root of this word actually means worthy. And the sense of this is usually worthy of respect. So we look to Buddhas as models of practice, right? Models of awakening, how we should behave as bodhisattvas. So how they behave is worthy of respect. And then how do we take that on? So we're going to come back to practice Buddhas in a minute, because practice Buddhas is a whole interesting thing, right? But first we have to consider that this gate statement says entry into all conduct. And when I look at that, I go, It's not just, conduct yourself in a certain way. Entry into all conduct. What is that about? So that's kind of, it's the subject of the statement. So does that mean we're supposed to carry out like every possible form? Does that mean we enter into every single practice activity on the calendar? I mean, that seems kind of impossible. How do you enter into, everything? So last week we saw that entry into, in the case of these statements, means, I think, dropping off body and mind. Completely manifesting, for instance, unrestricted speech, right? How do we do that? Let go of separation. We drop off body, speech, and mind. Or for this week, all conduct. So in all our actions, dropping off body and mind. Fully realizing, making real, awakening. So in all our actions, seeing that there is no gap between practice and realization, transcending all distinctions without disregarding all distinctions, right? If we're disregarding, we're not seeing the whole picture. It's not about ignoring distinction. It's about holding all of it. So we're transcending all distinctions without disregarding forms, for instance. We're seeing form and emptiness. We're not disregarding forms in our practice. We're seeing the larger picture. So entering into all conduct is remembering moment by moment. We are bodhisattvas moving through this network of interdependence, right? Over and over again, opening the hand, letting go of clinging, 5 skandhas clinging to 5 skandhas, paying attention to all of our actions of body, speech, and mind, knowing that there's not one of them that isn't setting up causes and conditions for the next thing to unfold. So in a way, that's kind of exciting. Every single thing we're doing is setting up some kind of cause and condition, so every single thing we're doing can be beneficial action. On the other hand, that can seem scary and overwhelming. Right? What do you mean every single thing I do, I have to pay attention. So this is not about clinging to those outcomes, but simply maintaining some awareness, right? So that we're kind of never practicing in isolation. So the next thing might be, whatever that next thing that unfolds is, the next thing might be something that directly affects other people. The people in the room with you, or the people downstream of you, or something. Or it might just be that we're establishing some wholesome or unwholesome habits for ourselves. It might be that we're simply, this is bouncing back to us. So, over the years, when I have wanted to take shortcuts in my practice, as we all do, I admit it, as we all do, oh well, there's no one around, I'm going to do half that job today. Oh well, nobody's looking, I'm going to do. less than 100%. So when I notice that going on for me, the remedy for me has been to remind myself, let go of my clinging to my opinion, how this should be, right? Fully enter into the practice of this moment, whatever that is. And then I notice my resistance to whatever it is sort of calms down. And I remind myself that what I'm doing is practice, and that could be taking out the cat litter. My resistance to it goes down. Oh yeah, this is just practice. This is just another form of practice. It's not I have to get through taking out the cat litter so I can watch my program on TV. Every single thing is one practice after another, right? One form of gyo after another. So, one's not better, worse, more important than another. So, here's the dynamic I've seen in myself over time. Maybe this happens to you as well. I notice that my activity, in the Zendo particularly, can be driven by the need to support the practice of others. I can tell myself, I'm here to support the practice of other people. And that's my practice. And that's not wrong, right? But if there aren't any others here, then continuing to carry out my practice can start to feel like a lost opportunity to do something else. Oh, well, there's no one in the Zendo today for Zazen, so I'm going to do some other temple task, or I'm going to do something else, right? And on the one hand, that's not wrong. My time is limited. There's a temple to run. There's things to do. If there's nobody in the Zendo, is that the best use of my time? Should I not be taking care of the things I don't have time to do otherwise? And on the other hand, this is classic suffering, right? This is classic, I want things to be other than they are. So any other time, if people were here, I wouldn't be thinking twice about doing whatever it is that's my job to do. So clearly I have an opportunity to do some discernment here about non-reliance. Good old non-reliance. What is driving my practice? What is what is getting me here and doing the practice activities that I have vowed to do? Is it my own bodhicitta, or is it my job description? So it's an interesting place of discernment, right? If we feel like we only want to do half the job, like what's going on there? So my guess is I'm telling a story about me, but I might also be telling a story about you. And it might not be Zendo related. It might be your job or your kids or cleaning your house. Right? We're tempted to do part of the job because nobody's looking, oh well. And then you think, okay, if I'm taking this on as practice, would I not 100% wholeheartedly enter into this thing without distinctions, without opinions? Just the carpet needs to be vacuumed, that's the next practice. I'll tell you, being in a training temple is wonderful practice for that. You don't get to choose. The bell rings, you do the next thing. You don't have to like it. Even during work period, you're out there doing your samu and the bell rings or the drum goes off that says you're done, and you go, I just fought 5 more minutes to finish this. Nope, you put it down. You do the next thing. It's wonderful training for letting go of ego. Right? Letting go of preferences. Okay, so let's briefly review the last part of the gate statement, this Buddha I piece. By now this is familiar to us, right? We talked about this last week again, these 5 eyes that come from the Diamond Sutra, but quick review for those who weren't here. First one is the flesh eye, or the ordinary eye that we use every day to distinguish color and form, right? Second one is the heavenly or divine eye, so we can see beyond physical limitations of darkness or distance, but we still can have some delusions, some misunderstandings about exactly what we see. Third one is the wisdom eye, so we see everything with prajna. In other words, we see the emptiness of all things. We may still be working on compassion. There may still not be 100% compassion there. Fourth one is the dharma eye, so we see as bodhisattvas, and we see what that means in order to liberate beings. So not only do we see everything clearly, it's like we know what to do to help people liberate beings. Fifth one is the Buddha eye, so we see the complete truth of all phenomena, past, present, and future. This eye includes the functions of all the other eyes. So this is where all duality, all separation gets collapsed. There's no divide between subject and object. There's no, Buddha seeing something with the Buddha eye. There's just seeing. There's just total dynamic functioning. So the Buddha eye doesn't separate space into distinct kind of places, doesn't separate time into distinct days and hours. There's just this unsurpassable true awakening where here and now is not separate from all time and space. So maybe you've seen eyes of Buddha like painted on the sides of stupas, particularly in Vajrayana contexts. You've seen the little eyes, right? painted on stupas or on buildings, you'll see them painted on all four sides, because Buddha eye sees in all directions, up and down and past, present, and future, right? So all directions throughout space and time. So the Buddha eye sees the true reality of all beings, and some years ago, Todo-san explained what Dogen Zenji meant in the Tenzo Kyokan, talking about Buddha eye. So Dogen says, do not see with your common eyes and do not think with your common sentiment. So Todo-san was explaining the difference between Bongen, or common eye, and Butsugen, or Buddha eye. Bon is a word used for actions or qualities or people who are not Buddha, or who are not behaving as Buddha. So using the common eye results in chasing after things, escaping from things, competing with other people, doing the things that cause us to transmigrate through the 6 realms, right? Stay in samsara with our suffering. So Bon and Butsu can be seen as opposites, or as two sides of something. So Butsugen, or the Buddha eye, is the same as Jiju Yudzamai, total dynamic functioning, no separation, right? Everything we encounter is our life, as Uchiyama Roshi says, right? That's another way to say that or think about that. So Todo-san made the point that when we're working in the kitchen as Tenzos, we don't think about that as a place that requires the Buddha eye. We get really caught up in doing the next task, getting the cereal cooked, getting the fruit chopped, getting the water boiled. We do those things, and maybe we get impatient with our coworkers, and the point is, oh my gosh, we're on schedule. We got to feed practitioners, the bell's ringing. That can feel like a place where we don't necessarily bring in the Buddha eye. Actually, the kitchen, of course, is just as much a place of practice as the Zendo. I was a Tenzo for 3 years, and I took that on as a practice, and I really got to experience how that practice and how that place is as much a place of practice requiring the Buddha eye as anything else we do. So I think Gyobutsu Igi, the dignified conduct of practice Buddhas, is the intersection of these two halves of this gate statement. So we have conduct or practice, and we have the Buddha eye. So these two things are intersected, I think, in this gate statement. In order to really enter into practice as continuous realization, we have to see reality completely without separation, using the Buddha eye. Or to say it the other way, when we see with the Buddha eye, when we see the true reality of all beings in the past, present, and future, then dignified conduct of practice Buddhas is what arises. That's what's there. We can't not do that, right? We can't do something else. So that means we don't disregard what comes in through the senses. Again, this is not about pushing something away. We're not disregarding the flesh eye and all the things that go with that. We accept that this human condition comes with delusion. We vow to see through that delusion without judgment. We're never going to 100% get rid of our delusion. Can we see it clearly, and can we act skillfully around it? We see one reality from two sides. We express two sides in one action. That's a familiar phrase for us. We use our understanding to liberate beings. That's, the Dharma piece, the Bodhisattva piece. And because we aren't separate from those beings or from the total functioning of the universe or of this one unified reality, right? We know how to use the Buddha eye. We see with the Buddha eye. So Todo-san has written, in Gyobutsu Igi, Igi means form, and Gyo stands for practice. So Gyobutsu Igi means practice Buddha's decorum or Buddha's form. Gyobutsu Igi is the name of one of the chapters of the Shobogenzo. In that chapter, he uses the word Gyobutsu as a name for Buddha. Our practice is a Buddha named Gyobutsu. Not this person, but this person's practice is a Buddha. And here's Dogen turning something completely on its head, right? Because we'd usually think that a Buddha has to be a person, an awakened one. So somebody has done a lot of practice in 500 previous lives or in this life or something. Here is a person, an awakened one, that's a Buddha. Dogen's going, that's not the only thing that can be Buddha. As soon as we see it, like a Buddha has to be a person, then there's a person, and the actions of that person, and something called awakening, and now we've created some separation. A practice Buddha is simply awakening without any fabrications about what awakening and Buddhism practice are. Isn't it interesting to consider our practice itself a Buddha? It's like, wow, Like, how do I get my head around that? We can't make a statue of that and put it on the altar, right? So, Dogen Zenji says, all Buddhas without exception fully practice dignified conduct. This practice is practice Buddha. Sharing one corner of the Buddha's dignified conduct is done together with the entire universe, the great earth, and with the entire coming and going of life and death. This is nothing other than the dignified conduct of the oneness of practice and Buddha. So awakening may take some form that we can call decorum, or conduct, or ethical behavior. But all conduct and Buddha and the Buddha eye and awakening and realization are already not separate from the very beginning. There's no way to pull these things apart. So when we see clearly, practice happens. When we practice, we make awakening concrete in the world. So in other words, when we practice, Buddha appears. Practice and Buddha, not different. When we practice, there's Buddha. This is why Buddha is still alive, right? Whenever people are practicing, there's Buddha. That's how Buddha's still in the world. So this is a key theme of Dogen's teaching, right? Awakening doesn't have meaning unless and until we engage in practice. Awakening is not a theoretical something out there in a cloud. Here's awakening. And the only way that we realize that is practice. So we start to see how practice can be a Buddha, right? So in Gyobutsu Igi, again, he says, active Buddhas alone fully experience the vital process on the path of going beyond Buddha. They bring forth dignified conduct with their bodies, thus their transformative function flows out in their speech, reaching throughout time, space, Buddhas, and activities. And again, unrestricted speech, right? So these things are connected. Active Buddhas see with the Buddha eye, and they go beyond Buddha. So they completely manifest awakening without having any idea about being Buddha and manifesting awakening. Right? So active Buddhas alone fully experience the vital process on the path of going beyond Buddha. So Dogen says, this is a vital process. This is something that's alive. This is something that's dynamic. The dignified conduct is a practice. It's something we do moment by moment. It's not our idea, right? It's not a form we put on. It's not a performance. So Dogen goes on to say that even though it's people who are engaging in this conduct, in this limited karmic human form, our limited karmic human form can't defile it. So Toda-san says, the Lotus Sutra says only a Buddha together with a Buddha can fathom the true reality of all beings. Only a Buddha together with a Buddha means no human beings. So the subject of this practice is not this independent person, but all beings. This entire network practices through this single person's body and mind. So this sitting is not my personal action, even though I use my personal body and mind. That separation falls down. I think that's really interesting. Early on in my practice, I remember reading something about practice is, the universe seeing itself. And I had a hard time sort of getting my mind around that, but there's something about that that I still think is really interesting. This entire network practices through this single person's body and mind. How can we be separate? Like, this is the conduit, right? This is the manifestation. This is the outlet, right here, of something which is much bigger than me. There's something really interesting to sit with about that. So the Buddha eye sees karmic human form for what it is. So there's no hindrance, no delusion. This karmic form is what it is. There is suchness about this karmic human form. So there's nothing about this which is defiled. And it doesn't defile this practice or this awakening. So this body and mind is perfectly fine as a vessel of the Dharma, even though we think sometimes we make a lot of mistakes. Or there's something about this karmic human form which is not quite perfect, And yet in the Zui Monkey, over and over, Dogen says, do not think you are not a vessel of the Dharma. There's no way you are not a vessel of the Dharma. How can you be separate from that functioning? So our actions are complete manifestations of this dynamic functioning of the universe, because they can't not be that. We're not separate from that. So defilement doesn't happen until we start poking our heads in, right? Having ideas about what should be happening and whether we like it or not. And do I think this practice is meaningful? Man, I've been assigned to sweep the steps again. Surely there's something more meaningful than that, right? Well, as soon as we poke our heads in, now we've got hierarchies and defilement and delusion and ideas. Whereas if we simply wholeheartedly entered into sweeping the steps, practice Buddha is right there. So a few weeks ago, Toda-san on a Sunday talked about this phrase, practicing our understanding and understanding our practice, which I also think is really interesting. So I think this is exactly entering into all conduct and realizing the Buddha I. Practicing our understanding and understanding our practice. So it's not just enough to put on a practice performance. We have to understand where that's coming from. And it's our understanding that's driving that, kind of not the other way. So I'm going to let Uchiyama Roshi have the last word today. Just sit in the reality of life, seeing hell and paradise, misery and joy, life and death, all with the same eye. No matter what the situation, we live the life of the self. We must sit immovably on that foundation. This is essential. This is what becoming one with the universe means. If we divide this universe into two, striving to attain Satori and to escape delusion, we are not the whole universe. Happiness and unhappiness, Satori and delusion, life and death, see them with the same eye. In every situation, the self lives the life of the self. Such a self must do itself by itself. This universal life is the place to which we return. So what would you all like to say about conduct, practice, and entering into that with the Buddha I? Comments, thoughts, reflections, questions, please.
I'm very much taken with this notion of a number of eyes. And what occurs to me is and it relates to what you said about when you're placed in the position. As I understand it, you were running a kind of kitchen, if I can put it that way. So, are there larger eyes that need to be added to the list? And what I'm thinking of are sort of institutional eyes. That is, as we participate in, as we inevitably do, families, work, you name it, this. Do we take on additional eyes, as it were, and how does that fit with that last remark about kind of sitting in the self? I'm just curious where this goes.
Sure. So, classifying anything into groups is artificial, because there's already no separation between all of those eyes. Right? The Buddha I takes on the function of all the other eyes. So saying that there are only 5 is a way for limited human brains to practice. So we could say there are an infinite number of eyes. And if you want to look for an image of that, look for the kanon with 1,000 hands and eyes. And 1,000 is also just a number that means an infinite, right? So there's an eye in each palm to see all the sufferings of beings and how the universe works, and in thousands and thousands and thousands of situations, what do we do? So kanon shows up in all those situations with all these eyes. So that too is an interesting image. 1,000 hands and eyes. Certainly if we're working in institutions, that's just another form of community. Right? Any collection of human beings, we can say that's a community with particular kinds of needs. So that 4th eye, the dharma eye, the eye that we use as bodhisattvas to say how do we liberate beings, I think is not unconnected to that. So I think you can certainly apply those teachings to a particular circumstance, draw a line around it provisionally and say that's an institutional eye. I don't think that hurts anything. As long as we understand Buddha eye includes all the other eyes. Right? So in the largest possible sense, seeing as Buddha means we're seeing all of that. So we're using this human eye to distinguish color and form, and we're understanding that there's delusion for ourselves and others, and we're seeing with prajna, so we see the emptiness, that's the 3rd one. We're using the dharma eye, so as bodhisattvas we know how to actually do something, not just watch with our eyes, but how do we actually do something to liberate beings? And the Buddha eye sees and does all of it, right? So there's a lot of ways to think about community, and especially for those of us that don't live in a temple. I don't live in a temple now, right? It can be a useful practice to say, I'm constantly in one or more communities. I'm in the community of the people in this grocery line. I'm in the community of these people in the doctor's office. I'm in the community of people on the road with me driving. Cars, bicycles, motorcycles, pedestrians, right? We're constantly in community. So how do we navigate that? Because of course there's some things about that that's situational, right? So the manners of around the table with the queen or the king are different than the manners at home, and yet, right? That's another community. So if I'm managing a kitchen, that's a particular community within a larger community. There are certain expectations, certain conventions. What happens when you cut your finger? If you're working in a big kitchen, big practice kitchen like somewhere at Tasahara in San Francisco complex, if you cut your finger, there's a whole set of protocols. And this was pre-COVID. It's a whole set of protocols that come in about, they take you and they bandage you and they wash everything you've touched. And I mean, right, there's a whole, and you get why. I mean, for the sake of all the communities, that's important. And yet if you're working at home in your kitchen, you wouldn't do that necessarily, right? You're cooking for yourself, oh well.
Well, let me, if I could follow, just, are
Please.
there community, what I'm thinking about, what I'm hearing is practice is community here and now.
Yes,
And its demands.
yes.
But then communities are there and then, they have futures, goals.
Mhm.
So are there communities to be avoided, I guess, is what I'm wondering.
We can't avoid any communities as bodhisattvas.
Okay.
We can't. We have to be thoughtful, careful, wise, compassionate about what we're doing in those communities. That doesn't mean if I'm working in a toxic community, I have to just put up with it.
Okay.
Sometimes discretion is the better part of valor, and you don't step into a toxic community without being very careful what you're doing. Like, why am I doing that? Am I doing that to be the hero? Okay, can I be effective? Am I actually going to save beings by walking into that community, or is it better to call 911, you know? I mean, so compassion has to be smart compassion. That's why wisdom and compassion go together, right? Are there communities to be avoided? I think it's not, we always avoid this community. I think in this circumstance, in this moment, presented with the suffering I'm presented with, what is the wisest, compassionate thing as a bodhisattva that I should do? Am I Jizo going into hell? Maybe. Am I the one looking in the window going, I need backup, man, get the cavalry? Because for me to step in there would not be smart and would hurt me and not probably result in any kind of liberation for anybody, right? So, you know, communities are certainly constantly changing. I see that all the time here, like every time we have sesshin. This is not, you know, so if I'm in the training temple doing sesshin, there's an established community of practitioners. We're there 24/7. We do the same thing, you know, 6 out of 7 days, right? When we sit sesshin, it's the same people. We know the score. We've done it before. We're in our home place. That's a very different thing than a place like this, where every sesshin is a pop-up community. Every sesshin is people coming who don't typically come here, don't typically live here, and very quickly have to gel into a pretty intensive practice container. I watch this happening. It's really interesting. I mean, just because I like org development and sanghas, I just think it's interesting. So here's a pop-up community, and we're practicing pretty intensively for 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, and then that collection disperses. And the next session is going to be a different group of people. Maybe some of the same, but those circumstances are different, you know. So within this unchanging thing called sesshin practice, there's also this dynamic that says this is so impermanent, right? Every group, we start again. Every group comes together. Every group disperses, right? So even, you know, so communities are impermanent also because they're aggregates. Five skandhas is a community in that way, right? It's an aggregate of things that are coming together, and then, right? So every time that comes together, something different happens. That can be scary, and that can be exasperating, and that can be really interesting, right? It really reminds us how vital dynamic this practice is. This group is not the same every Sunday. Many of you are familiar to me, and yet, right? Next week, Doju's giving the talk. It's going to be a whole different thing. So yeah, we have to sort of take that community in this here and now, what's happening, and then how do I respond to that as the most skillful bodhisattva I can be? Is that enough?
No, that's very, very good. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Not at all.
It helps.
I think you can summarize it as the interest net is your community.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you know, when we look at the largest possible interconnectedness, right? What is that? But the biggest possible community. So when we look at sangha in the absolute sense of sangha, what being is not included? It's a huge community. You also had your hand up, please.
Yeah.
Give us some teachings.
Follow up on a thread there, and this is not new territory. This is something that we've, as a community, discussed before. But whenever this kind of notion of sort of just do it, kind of take your role and kind of don't complain and just do it. of course, the danger in that is always, as you already mentioned, what if this is some kind of unfair, toxic sort of situation? And there have been academic works that have suggested, theorized that this aspect of Buddhism in Japan has been used to justify social inequality.
Yep.
Whether or not that's true, I am a little agnostic, but I guess the question is, how do we find the line? Because I think it's easy to, at least for some people, to feel victimized in almost any situation. Even if it's just a very slight thing, and any community is going to have aspects that are not perfect, of course. So when can we be comfortable, I think, just sort of taking what's given to us, and when do we need to stand up and do something about it, and can we do both of those at the same time?
Yeah. Well, that's a whole conundrum, isn't it? So to begin with, I think we have to trust that the place that we're in is a wholesome place. So even if it's a wholesome place, people are going to make mistakes. Leaders are going to make mistakes, right? Community members are going to make mistakes. But overall, I think we have to feel like the place we're practicing in, the Sangha, the community in which we're practicing, is a wholesome and healthy place. And if it's not, then we need to think carefully about what's going on. In general, so, when I was in the training temple in Japan, those conditions can be challenging. They're challenging physically, and they're challenging emotionally and mentally in every way. And it's designed to push you, right? I mean, that's the point of being there, is to challenge yourself. So, you could walk into that situation and say, this is not wholesome or healthy because, I have a limited amount of choice, or there's gender inequality, because there is. I mean, there just is. The nuns are making the tea, the guys are, ringing the bells. I'm not going to change that after 800 years as one single solitary Westerner coming in for 6 months or a year. I mean, I'm not going to change it. Okay, so in that circumstance, I have two choices. I can either say, this is horrendously toxic, this is perpetuating stereotypes, this is just not okay with me, and if there was true harm happening, I don't care where you are, you need to probably say something. Or I can say, this is the circumstance I'm in. Like, what is the best way for me to be helpful, useful in this situation? What can I actually change? And how much of this is about my ego getting pricked, I generally felt like when I was there, I had the chance to do everything I thought I wanted to do, to learn to do everything I wanted to learn to do. Now, granted, I was in a sort of a co-ed situation, which is a little unusual, and there were more Westerners than Japanese at the time. So I think it's easier for Westerners to step into that situation and go, patriarchy, authoritarianism, Okay, and what happens if I put my ego over here and say, I've been assigned to make the tea. So for today, I'm going to make the tea, right? I have seen toxic situations which were not okay. Fortunately, leadership could see what was happening and took some steps to remove people, or to move them, or to do something about that. But I think I think job one, particularly for Westerners, is to accept that a practice container often means we don't get a choice. That feels really hard for us, like incredibly hard for us, If you read the website, on Taiji's website, it actually makes the point in there that says, you will be here following a schedule and you will not get to choose. And the fact that they actually had to say that, I think, is really interesting. They actually had to say, when you get here, you will follow the schedule. You will take a work assignment, you will do what's being done, and you don't get to choose. And that just feels like, right? So, I think we have to be really, of course there's no one answer, as you've said, and I think we have to be really careful about the basis for our decision making. Am I deciding this is a toxic circumstance because I don't get to choose, or is this really a toxic circumstance because harm is happening? Like, harm is happening. We can't all agree what harm is. So, there's no checkbox. If there's this, there's harm, right? There's lots of... So, as bodhisattvas, this is why we need both wisdom and compassion. Sometimes we speak up and we go, okay, this wasn't the time, or that wasn't the teachable moment, or something, right? But I think it's really easy for us to have a reaction rather than a response, right? And just say, because I don't get to choose, this is not okay with me. Well, really? There were plenty of times in Japan, I gotta say, if there was a jet plane in the front yard, I would have got on it, and gone, because it pushes you. But it's supposed to push you, right? I mean, that's what our practice does. We're afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, right? As they say in other traditions. So if we're not being pushed, are we 100% wholeheartedly entering into practice? Because we're not getting to see where our delusion is, where our sticking points are. That's an important part of our practice, but it's not very comfortable. Do you want to say some more things about that? I mean, you've had experience with Japan and communities.
What came to mind, since you mentioned Antaiji, before I started practicing, I read a lot on Muho, his website, and he said that his teacher, whenever he, I guess, started to get testy or something, his teacher would say, "You don't matter at all." But then in other times, if he was kind of not, I don't know, maybe a little bit withdrawn, he would say, "You're the one that makes Antaiji." And, he talked about how meaningful it was to have this kind of binary, on the one hand, you do have to kind of just fall into to Indra's net, so to speak, but on the other hand, it is your actions that sort of play a part in that community and so forth, so I thought that was really interesting.
I love that as two balanced things, right? You don't matter at all, and you make Antaiji. Because, this is what I tell people, when we do Sesshin, there's this idea that Sesshin is a performance that something we are putting on for guests. And that whether or not they're there doesn't make any difference. Practice is going to happen anyway, whether or not they're there. So along about the last day, people used to come sidling up to me and go, "Now, I'm going to be leaving early." And I would say, "I hope not." Because what would happen is by the end of Sesshin, those who've done Sesshin here will remember the days. By the end of Sesshin, the Tenzo is furiously cooking lunch for all 14 or whatever people. And by the end of the day, there were maybe 3 people left. So we'd had this wonderfully intense practice experience, and then on the last day, all that energy started trickling out the door. One by one, people would fade away. No closure, just they had to leave, And by the time we get to lunch, well, the Tenzo's cooked for 14, we've got 3 people, so we wasted all those resources, right? People didn't understand, if they're not here, there's no practice. If people are not here manifesting awakening, where is Buddha? There is no practice here. So it's not like there's a stage and people moving around on the stage and folks are in the audience, and if there's, if you leave early, well, you've paid your ticket, the performance goes on. It's like without you, there's no Antaiji. It's a really important thing to understand. If there weren't people here, there wouldn't be practice. So, so lest you think it's not important that you show up here once in a while, it's not about we need you for your volunteer labor. It's that, this is practice. Where else is practice but here? I love those two things. I'm going to remember that. I love that. It's great. You don't matter, and you make up, and you are, how did he put it? You are Antaiji?
I think it's you make
Antaiji.
You make the temple, I guess you could say.
I love it. What would others in the room like to say before we go to the people at home? Please, Will, and then Clark.
So I was struck with the topic of breaking off ego. Just do what you're told. And another context where that is probably very true is military boot camp.
People make a lot of comparisons between the training temple and military boot camp.
So in a sense, I actually feel an affinity for people who've been through that.
Yeah.
So my question is not fully formed. So I want to attack it from a historical perspective. Is there a relationship between war, military, and Zen? I know there was the samurai tradition, and then I don't know. Is there any more value connection between boot camp and Shikataza?
Well, that's it. So, of course, you could spend a week. Books have been written. I have to say it's not an area of my particular expertise. I'm also going to refer you to Doju's talk next week where he's talking about Buddhism and war. So we may come back to some of these things, right? So certainly there is some history, I think, about Zen being used as a way to prepare people for kamikaze, and for making the ultimate sacrifice in terms of war. So it's interesting, there are Buddhist chaplains in the military now, and in the Western military now, and I always think, what an interesting place to be in, right? How do you help people and provide spiritual direction in a Buddhist context for people who've chosen that life? Because you can't judge, So it's like, how do you help people practice with the whole precepts, ethical thing around that, and just life and death and all that stuff, right? So, I don't have an easy answer for you, because I think that can be really fraught, and I would want to be careful what I said.
Sure.
So I'm just going to say, I encourage you to dig into that intersection, because I think there's some interesting stuff there. I think there are resources for that. We'll see what Doju brings us next week and how we continue that conversation. Certainly, in a Western Dharma context where there is socially engaged Buddhism and people doing peace work, I think those questions come up, right? I think those intersections come up, and I don't think anybody's found a quick, easy answer. I think if we think we have a quick, easy answer, we're missing something, right? So, certainly when you're looking at boot camp, or you're looking at training temple, or you're looking at any circumstance where it's a pretty regulated community, there's a schedule, there's expectations, there's assignments, whatever, I think an interesting similar dynamic can happen. And it's always a challenge to the ego, right? So I think in those circumstances, whenever we're butting up against expectation, we get to watch what happens, because it's uncomfortable. Or we can fold in completely and congratulate ourselves for folding in completely, and then there's another whole thing we get to worry about, right? I'm not going to leave you with a satisfactory answer for that. Let's just say that's an open
It's
conversation.
okay, no attachment.
Good, thank you. Clark, what did you want to say or offer?
So when I think about conduct, I think there's all these questions, what to do, what not to do, right? And I was struck years ago, I read a book called The Trusted Advisor, and it's a guy who he's a consultant on creating trust. And he has this mathematical equation. He says trust equals reliability, dependability, credibility, divided by self-interest. And if you know anything about math, that's the big number, is the one on the bottom, because the bigger it is, the smaller the one on the top is, right? So when I think about conduct now, it's really the same thing. That's ego to me. That divisor is ego. And if I can take my ego out, like being corrected, I hate being corrected. Why? Because it's my ego. Why? How dare you correct me? But when I see, correction is good because it helps me tamp down that ego. That's the only thing guide I have for conduct right now is how much of this is my ego wanting to be the good guy and save all the homeless people, or how much is it me just wanting to genuinely help another human being?
Well, and of course, there's almost nothing we do that doesn't have some measure of self-interest. That doesn't mean we don't do that good action, but we get to watch the self-interest around that, right? Correction is another whole interesting arena
That's the boot camp.
for managing in the training temple, because Westerners will go to the training temple or go to a Western place which derives from that kind of practice, and someone gets publicly corrected, and they immediately feel, they collapse, and they sometimes will pull the person aside who corrected them and say, couldn't you have done that in private? No, because the way we learn here is somebody makes a mistake and gets corrected. Now everybody gets to learn. That's not the way we do it. We do it like this. So you're not important at all, right? It's not a public shaming of that person. If somebody makes a mistake and we all get to learn, that's not how we do it, then we're not correcting each individual person every time somebody rotates into that job, right? So it's not about the ego. I always took correction as a compassionate thing, because it meant to me, somebody thinks I can do this properly, that this is important enough that I should do it properly, whatever properly means, right? Because I think the kiss of death is, we don't care what you do because you're never going to amount to anything, right? So when I was in Japan and somebody corrected me, I thought, well, that's interesting. So as a Westerner, as a female, they think I can carry this practice, and they want me to do it just like everybody else. That felt encouraging to me, like somebody cared enough to correct me. One of the things I have done sometimes in my life when I go to a very small Dharma center that only has one teacher, and that teacher is the only person anyone has ever seen, is to be the person who gets corrected in public, to demonstrate how that works. So it's not something I set up ahead of time, you know, but I remember being at Hokyoji once, and I think I was a novice then, and serving, we were doing formal serving of meals, and I was bending over to serve somebody, and one of the teachers who knew that I would know what was going on said, "Hoko," I said, "Yes." "Sit up straight." "Yes, I will." And then 3 people later, I'd forgotten again, right? But I thought, I know what they're doing. They're saying, this is how we correct people, and everybody, look, this is what should be happening, and it's not happening, right? So correction is a whole interesting arena. But I could take that because that was a container that I trusted. I knew that nobody was there to shame me personally. I knew what was going on. I could trust that system and that process and that community, so I felt okay about it. I mean, did I want to make a mistake? No. But let's use it to show somebody else, right? So, yeah. Other things in this room? Please.
So just a quick thought on the boot camp thing,
Ah!
and then a question,
Okay.
which is, I remember this coming up in a Wednesday night group at some point, and you know, you pointed out that, you know, any community is oriented towards something that organizes that community, and so if you're in a military situation, that's a kind of community where you might learn something about ego, but it's not like it's the same thing as a temple community or a sangha, which is gathered to basically study and practice dharma.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so there's your ego may be being broken down, but it's within a context of, okay, we're here to,
Right.
you know,
That's important.
peace for all beings.
Yep, that's
So
important.
you know, it's not like any community is just
That's
you
true.
fold in and you learn.
That's right.
Um,
So situational again, right?
right.
So yes, that's important.
And then my question is kind of, I don't know, theoretical, but it's about, I've always wondered why in the 5 eyes, why is there a prajna eye separate from a dharma eye?
Mm.
Why is it that there is this eye that is supposedly only wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
only seeing emptiness,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can't sort of distinguish between anything, and so you can't help,
Right.
when we always sort of say wisdom and compassion
Arise together.
So
Yeah.
why is there this I that supposedly exists
Yeah.
separately?
Well, so I'm going to give you my speculation because I'm going to think that Toto-san probably doesn't want to give us another Dharma talk in this moment. So my speculation is the wisdom and compassion are there because they arise together, but can we see them both and act from that place? Possibly not. So we've got the wisdom and compassion, we've got form and emptiness. We can see the emptiness of all beings, but we can't see the whole thing. So we're seeing the wisdom, but we can't yet quite see the compassion or use the compassion. Right? So, it's one thing to see this reality, and it's another thing to know how do I turn that into beneficial action. So I think there's some incompleteness there, right? That's my speculation.
Just a follow-up on that. If the phrase wisdom beyond wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
would that be relevant here where we have this extra I?
Yeah, wisdom beyond wisdom, Mahaprajna Pranamita. Yeah. So the wisdom that doesn't understand wisdom, the Buddha that doesn't know he's Buddha or she's Buddha, right? Not having any sort of limited ideas about wisdom, awakening, compassion. saving beings. I think that's not irrelevant.
I'm remembering when you were talking about that at the last Dharma talk, what I was hearing was almost like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
And we have to be careful about that.
Yeah, well, okay, I understand it, but you said something about, you get to the prajna eye, and that itself entails the route to the compassion, so that they are interconnected, but you get to the compassion through the wisdom. Am I remembering this correctly?
I think that's, I think we can, in a provisional way, say that. But we also know, really, as soon as we see, so it's a bit of a conundrum, right? Because really, if we really see with the wisdom eye, we can't help but have compassion arise, because we already see interconnectedness, we already see impermanence, we already see the nature of suffering. It's like, we can't really pull them apart, but for our sort of limited capacity in trying to understand what's happening, we can make some distinctions. So I'm going to say, let's not get too caught up in like going down that rabbit hole, because on the one hand there's 5 eyes, and on the other hand there's an infinite number of eyes, right? And they're not really separate. So like so much of our practice, we can try to draw a picture, but actually we can't capture it in that way. So, wisdom can be a conduit to compassion, but we also have to be careful not to separate them, right? You look like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'm
Please.
just, the phrase, I guess it's used more in the Rinzai tradition of Zen sickness.
Zen sickness.
Of how it can kind of be a trap, maybe to think that what we need is just the prajna eye and
Right.
not the dharma eye.
Right.
So like, it would be enough just to see emptiness, but
Right.
of course the tradition says that that's not the case. So I wonder if maybe that might be another thing too. It's kind of maybe there as like, to show that that's not the end.
I think that's true. I think that's right, because we can't stop there, right? And it's not enough to just see that, then we need to take action. As bodhisattvas, it's not enough to just say, well, I see all the emptiness of beings, now I'm going to sit here. I see the emptiness of beings, and now what do I do with that? Well, I'm going to liberate beings. I'm going to take some action, right? I'm going to do some beneficial action. I'm going to do some practice to liberate beings. So we can't just get stuck only halfway. That's important. Yeah. Please, say again.
In terms of what you were just saying there, it kind of reminds you of the, they say the hand and the eye.
Yeah.
So the hand is, the action of doing something.
Right. Yeah, there's hands and arms, right, in addition to the eyes in that figure of Kannon. So it's not enough just to see. There also has to be some action taken, some practice done, right? That's important. Thank you for that. Other things in this room before we move to folks at home? Not that we can't come back to you. Sawyer, is there anybody at home with something to say or ask or share?
Yeah, I think Alex has a question.
Alex, go ahead. Good to see you, or hear you.
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all. I just had a comment in response to what Will asked about the military connection. Not an answer to that question or anything, but just an observation. I never served in the military, but a lot of people around me did as a kid. So my dad was in the military, many cousins who were. And one thing that was really, that's really clear spending time around those individuals is that their time in the military was this deeply meaningful thing that has stuck, in my dad's case, has stuck with him for now close to 60 years, is like the single most meaningful period of time in his life. And I think that we have a lot of stories about why that is, about, service and defending your country and defending certain values, et cetera. But after I had been practicing for a few years, I started to pick up on a sort of resonance between the way my dad talked about his experience in the military and things that I had experienced in formal community-based Zen practice. That was this period of time where I think that he sort of got to, put aside, or, got to or had to put aside his narrow self-interest. There's this period of time where, you follow a schedule. It's a brutal schedule, but you follow a schedule. There's a lot of like deliberate arbitrariness. So like one person messes up, but then like very deliberately you get punished for it. And the idea is to sort of break down this idea that like we're not in it together. So like you're being taught in all sorts of ways that like the success of the group depends on every individual, and there's no distinctions. And I think that I kind of really suspect that there was some kind of like non-dual experience, that he had. The intention of that container is different in a lot of ways. I'm not saying that it's the same thing, but I think it's important, or it has helped me at least to understand something about why that experience is so deeply meaningful to people, and why, I used to wonder, like with my dad, he'll still talk about his experiences at, Parris Island, the Marine Corps boot camp in 1968. And earlier in my life, I wondered, like, man, that happened so long ago, but it's still so alive for you and still so important. And I think I have a better understanding now of how that could have made such a profound impact on him. And it kind of goes beyond the sort of like, if you were to ask him to consciously reflect on it, he would probably say things about, he would probably give a sort of like ideological response, but I think it was more, more embodied than that. So, in terms of the historical connection between Zen and the military, I know nothing about that, but I do think that there's some kind of like resonance between those two types of experience that I find really interesting. So I just wanted to offer that observation. Will's comment made me think about it.
Well, Marine boot camp in 1968, golly. Had to have been a pressure cooker. Good grief. The thing that occurs to me is that in many cases when we're in that kind of container, we are brought together with people we didn't choose, who might be very different from ourselves, and we have to get along, right? It happens in Sanghas, but it happens elsewhere. You're on a work team, or you're, doing something, you might not get to choose your compatriots. You don't necessarily like them all. You don't necessarily agree with all their values. They have very different backgrounds. They come from very different places, and somehow that has to gel, right? So there's something very interesting about that. Because one of the things, so we don't get to choose what we're doing. We don't get to choose the schedule we assign. We also don't get to choose who we do that with. And that can feel a little challenging. So yeah, so there may well be some similarities there, which is interesting, and so I suspect you've had some interesting conversations with your family members and your compatriots about that. So yeah, that's an open question here, an open conversation. Other things from people at home? Oh, Ritoku, you wanted first?
Yeah, this is something I have some personal connection to, because I did experience boot camp, and Daigo Roshi was also in the Navy. And I remember I had a retreat with him when I was getting a little annoyed with him, actually. I said to him, "You're running this place like a boot camp." And he was just quiet for a few seconds and said, "Yeah, I guess you're right."
We fall back on what we know, right?
Right.
Yes, indeed. Other things from people at home, Sawyer, that you can see?
Not that I see.
Have we had enough for today? We're a little past 11:30, so people may have had enough. Okay?
Thank you, it was very good, it really was.
Well, the juice of this is all y'all, right? Juice of this is, I throw some stuff out, but I'm not here to like teach you stuff. I'm here to put stuff on the table that we get to do this with. I think that's the fun part. So thanks for joining with me on that.
Oh, I just want to point out how much progress you made, that here you are running a temple, and I'm going to serve you tea.
Yes, and if called upon, I will serve tea whenever necessary.
The right posture.
With the right, I hope with the right posture. All right, thank you, everybody.